considered an investment company under the 1940 Act, or do you have some exemption? So A, do you get a qualified purchaser representative, which means every investor that you come in has a $5 million net worth of some sort, which is a very difficult threshold to meet. So for example, the JP Morgan offering caps it at $250,000 that the investors go into. But if you have corporations and the like, that's easy. But if you have individuals that are coming in, that may be a tough nut to look at, and that also reduces the number of investors you could bring in. Or do you just cap it at the exemption where you only take less than 100 investors? That's obviously a question that most people have. They don't know how they're going to structure it, but typically when we're looking at those from an offering standpoint, it's a risk disclosure that we need to make. Another risk disclosure that we look at is the capacity of the manager who is going to be running the fund. Does this individual have experience in the real estate development, assuming we're looking at some sort of real estate? Are they simply contributing property? They've sold the property, they've attributed the property, they've got 20% less under that 80-20 rule that was mentioned a little earlier. How exactly are they going to get monetized, and how do they earn their income? Those are sort of questions that we look at from a legal strategy standpoint when we're structuring the fund. One other component is what other sources of capital are in the capital stack. My firm, for example, does a lot of EB5 funding, and there's some correlations between the two. Both are alternative financing. EB5 has its own requirements. Opportunity Zone has its own requirements. Obviously, one is more foreign investment and the other one's more domestic. But at the end of the day, I think we were talking about job creation and the like. So that's an inherent requirement under the EB5 side. And if you actually, as a fund manager, are able to structure a good project and you go with a good fund administrator, I'll throw a plug in here, NES Financial, who's going to be presenting. They have a fantastic platform where they track all of the timelines and they actually track the jobs. You not only are able to give your EB5 investors that particular element of job attribution, but you can also do that for your Opportunity Zone investors, which in turn, down the line, I think communities are going to be looking at what the underlying impact is. You came into my location, you built this particular project. It had a lot of sort of indirect effects as a result of the development. All of that ends up getting tracked. So down the line, when policy makers are looking at what the net effect of Opportunity Zone is, at least it's all calculated. Things that Treasury may not have anticipated, or at least on the congressional level, maybe they intended to, but they didn't actually provide us data on how to do that. I think we can learn a lot from the EB5 side because it's been done. And if your fund manager is already doing it on the one end for an EB5 side, they should also consider doing it for Opportunity Zones.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left for questions. If there's anyone who would like to come to the microphone or just ask.
I'll just yell from here.
Yep.
In terms of the ongoing assessment, twice annual testing and what have you, what are the rules for that? Is it going to be, what about fluctuations in valuation if you're right on the brink? How's that all taken into consideration?
Yes. Does anyone?
Can I repeat the question?
So how do you deal with, for example, the valuation issues in the context of the testing? How's that going to play out?
I don't know if anyone else has solid answers on this, but what you bring up is actually a great point because we've got this twice a year testing, right? If you have an applicable financial statement, you probably have a 1231 financial statement but your June statement's not, that's not been audited or reviewed or anything like that. So I think there are definitely some holes in determining what the guidelines are going to be there. But especially when you have, the applicable financial statement that you're resting on. I've not seen anything that explains what the answer will be for that interim period. I don't know if anyone else has.
Yeah. I've got someone at the mic here, and then.
Hi, I'd like to kind of revisit the EB5 and the Opportunity Fund. Am I understanding correctly that they both complement each other if a particular fund is working with the project? But I'm also understanding from an EB5 service provider that because EB5 are project specific, they can't associate the EB5 funding with a fund. So I was wondering if you can provide some clarity on the complement of each other, but at the same time, what are some of the restrictions in EB5 and opportunity funds?
So there is one of the inherent differences is the EB5 fund is going to be a separate group. We're making an assumption if we structure a fund that you have a QOZ fund, QOF on one end, and then you have your EB5 on one end. You may have regular equity. All of it is going down into a qualified opportunity zone property, right? So the underlying component here is the development activity. So on the opportunity zone fund has its own set of requirements, which in many cases are complementary because at the downward spiral, we want to look at economic effect down at the property level. As far as the exit, this is where it gets a little tricky. On your opportunity zone side, your exit is at 10 plus years. So if you look at most of the funds, we're looking at a term wherein your eventual exit is at 12 or 13 years. On EB5, if we're structuring it as debt or equity, typically the timeline tends to be about 5 or 6 years. Now there is a differential here. If the EB5 side has investors from what are called backlog countries, for example, China, their time horizon is going to be much longer. So it really depends on what the EB5 entity has disclosed to investors on a timeline standpoint and whether or not they're going to have the ability to exit. That's the first thing. The second is how we're structuring it. If the EB5 is structured as debt, obviously that gets paid out first before the OZ side because that's on the equity. So, I mean, at the end of the day, what I was driving home was more the complementary effects on the downward side as opposed to on the fund level.
So we can use the EB5 funding to specifically invest in the asset, the project itself,
Absolutely.
as opposed to fund.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, right here, just quickly.
So as it relates to the 9% test, let's say we put $5 million into a QOZ down into or a QOF down into a QOZ, and we do development. 2 years later, the property was worth collectively $10 million. $10 million of equity, but the investment was only $5 million. And so once we get to a situation where we have, let's say, an appraisal at $10 million, for example, could we take 10% of that and have that invested in properties outside the QOZ? Or is it the 10% rule, is that 10% that can go outside of the QOZ, is that based on your equity in, or is it based on the valuation of the properties?
Okay, so the question is with respect to the 10% of bad assets, so to speak, that do you value it based on investment or fair market value?
Well, so I think that goes back to the same thing that the financial statements are, kind of like if you've got the applicable financial statement, that's what you're supposed to use, but there are other methods. And so I don't know if in your scenario you would have that you'd be valuing on a financial statement, because one of them is based on unadjusted cost basis, where you wouldn't, it wouldn't matter what the value is currently. So I think where that plays in is as long as you're making sure that it works with whatever method you're going to be using for valuing your assets, you would be able to move things, but you just need to understand that it's not just the property, that includes your cash, and everything else needs to be part of that 10%, so.
I think that they held that zero.
Oh, we got a
Yeah.
zero.
We
Okay.
can hang it, we can
Okay.
meet it and answer their questions.
Yeah, okay, we are over the zero, and I apologize to the people who stood up, but we will come down to the side here, or to the back, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, talk more about a project.